ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಇಟ್ಟಿನ ತರಕಾರಿ ಆಮೇಲೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ.
Hello, good evening, everyone. On behalf of Swatantrata, we would like to welcome you, all of you, to the Conclave on reopening and reforming Indian economy after COVID-19. And today's topic is very, very important because this unprecedented COVID-19 is not only push us into an health crisis, but also it leading to an economic crisis. We have seen most of the government actually using the lockdown as a measure to actually control and contain this COVID-19, but somewhat it become a question of lives versus livelihoods. So, so when it comes to choosing life between livelihood, both are very, very important. And our economy is actually collapsing even before COVID-19. And COVID-19 actually pushes us to see how strong our economy is, how much we can actually build our economy and make our people lives much better. And so over a period of time, when you see our Indian economy is not actually touched by the economic reforms since the last 2 decades. It's been waiting there. Most experts actually talking about these reforms to push our economic agenda. And most of the media companies actually discussing about this, but most of the politicians actually trying to promise it as as a way forward. But in terms of action, we haven't seen much. So I think we also can see this COVID crisis as an opportunity to mold it to utilize our advantage. How we can actually utilize this COVID-19 crisis and build something which can actually long last. Is it the right time to actually push our economic reforms to make sure our Indian economy is actually running towards the right direction? And to discuss on this, we have one of our own expert who is actually well known for most of us, Dr.JP Narayan garu, who is actually founder and president of the Lok Sabha and also Foundation for Democratic Reforms. And most of us know how much impact he actually created on political reforms and also in terms of the policy making, and his contribution to the India is actually phenomenal. And at a personal level, I mean, I consider myself as a legacy of Dr.JP Narayan's works, and also most of the listeners and also the people like Narasimha Dontineni and Ravi Raghavendra, who runs the parliament, Shrikant Reddy, who actually do the people against corruption, and Shivaram Krishna, who runs Youth for Better India. These are all organizations actually legacy of Lok Sabha and Dr.JP Narayan's work. And we would like to actually hear from JP Narayan garu about how we can actually utilize this crisis and build something which can actually utilize for us to build better lives and better economy, and what kind of policies or ideas that can actually help us to reopening and rebuilding Indian economy. Before I hand over mic to JP Garu, and I would like to give a quick note that so after JP Garu's talk, we will actually go through question and answers. I actually request please limit your questions to the top on Indian economy, and please try to write your note questions on Slido, which I will actually share in a minute. And so that once we have a question, we will actually call your name so that you can actually speak to JP Garu. Thank you so much. And I would like to welcome JP Narayan Garu to speak on the session.
Thank you, friends. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Okay. I have shared some slides. Do you have access to them?
I'm going to pull up. Yeah.
Yeah, then pull up the slides. What I propose is, let's make it a very brief presentation. I just have, I think, 8 or 9 slides. In between, as we go through the slides, if you have any question, and if you please feel free to raise that so that we can discuss that. And then hopefully we'll have not 20 minutes, but maybe even 30 minutes for the question answer session. Okay.
Sure.
First slide. Okay, move on. Next one. Friends, this is a brief summary of the present economic toll on account of the COVID crisis. A ballpark estimate is about 30,000 crores lost per day. After relaxation, things improved a little bit, but this is the lockdown was strictly implemented across the country. About 50% of the unorganized sector, they lost their jobs temporarily though. Please remember, about 90%, people say 93% of the workers in India are in the unorganized sector. Monthly wage earning job, and they simply eke out a precarious livelihood on a daily basis. All your construction workers and many in small and medium businesses, and of course, household services, many service sector, and agriculture, the vast agricultural thing. About 50% of SMEs, they're in grave threat. They could be shut down. It could be as serious as that. You know, if you lose business for 3 months in this very highly competitive global economy where the demand recession is going to be now, a large number of the small and medium enterprises that provide actually the largest employment in the country, both unorganized and organized, they could be in serious threat. Then agricultural supply chains are disrupted. In general, also they are bad, but now in some respects, some commodities, they become even worse. Many of you must have followed the tomato and other farmers who are in great stress in many parts of the country. Then the government, all of us, we want an efficient state, a state where our liberty and competition and choice in the economy and our fundamental rights are preserved. Unfortunately, moments like this give the state abnormal power. And there's a danger that the state may never give up this power fully, and people may accept meekly the state's intrusive role. And that's going to have consequences both politically and economically, and even socially, in fact. Even healthcare right now in the hospitals, not only is COVID a problem, but assuming that there are all COVID cases are addressed adequately or there are no COVID cases, the rest of the healthcare also is in disarray. So it's not merely that other sectors are bad and healthcare is okay. No, even in healthcare, except COVID, there's almost nothing else happening in the country. Next slide, please. Now, what is the realistic picture of the COVID crisis, this pandemic, in the Indian context? Lockdown has certainly yielded dividends, but urban poor and the migrant workers are suffering and have suffered a great deal. Now they're actually resisting because adequate precautions were not taken before imposing the lockdown. They should have given a 3 or 4 day notice, allowed them to go back homes, given them transport subsidy, given them assurance. They could have been with their families in the villages and come back when lockdown is relaxed. But unfortunately, because we did it peremptorily, typically in the Indian way, without adequate preparation, and they suffer a great deal. Many of these unorganized poor in the big cities, the migrant laborers, they don't have proper homes, no sanitation, no families, no ration card, no Aadhaar card, no Jan Dhan account. So even the welfare from the government, such as it is, doesn't reach them in many cases. Therefore, there's a lot of anger and distress. The homeless persons, migrant workers, slum dwellers, they cannot maintain social distancing. This is one thing we all must understand. It's very tempting when you are afraid to continue this whole lockdown forever. Two things we must understand. In the Indian context, it appears that the infection is not equal to disease. In a large number of cases, there's no serious disease. Even if the governments are not testing adequately and understating the number of infections, Certainly, if there is actual disease, we would have known from the hospitals, both private and government. Take, for instance, the dengue fever in season. Thousands flock to hospital for fear of dengue. Any fever, they presume it's a dengue fever. They go to hospitals and they insist on admission. And then a test will be done. Only when it's proven that it's not dengue, then they'll be discharged. You don't see such an atmosphere anywhere in the country in general. While we should take any infection, an infection of COVID kind, because if you do get the disease, by all accounts, it's a severe disease. And in some cases, it could be extremely critical. There is no doubt about it. While that is true, but if you take the totality of the picture, in the Indian conditions, for whatever reason, as of now, we'll have to see how the future unfolds. Maybe the heat here doesn't allow viral transmission much. Maybe the natural immunity in our country, much more than in other countries. Maybe the BCG vaccine, some people claim that gives a general immunity. And maybe there is a genetic predisposition to susceptibility in some cases, but in Indian cases, because the receptor binding proteins, binding is not there adequately in Indian population for this kind of a virus. We probably are resistant. So there are all kinds of theories. There's not yet adequate clinching evidence to be able to come to a definitive conclusion. We will know in time. But for whatever reason, I think it is reasonable to conclude at this point of time that the burden of real disease as opposed to infection is not very great. And therefore, we must keep that in mind while we look at both health crisis and economy. And we have to also remember, this is not a 1 week or 2 weeks or 2 months affair. It will be very definitely a 2-year affair. It will only end with one of 3 things happening, a combination of these things. The first is the infection spreads silently, but at a low level, not causing disease, and people develop immunity. Once 60–70% people get immunity, the disease transmission, the infection transmission will be interrupted. And therefore, it will become just another sporadic infection. We'll deal with that. But there's no fear of a pandemic or an epidemic. The second is a vaccine may come up. There is a reasonable chance that within the next year and a half, we will get 1 or 2 vaccines. I know for a fact a lot of serious efforts are underway across the world. And never before have we seen such intensive research. So some of them may fructify. There's no guarantee. There are diseases for which even today there's no immunization, there's no vaccine. But in this case, we may get a vaccine or 2. But even then, please remember, it will take time. Vaccine development doesn't happen in minutes or hours or days or weeks or even months. And 2, even if a vaccine is developed, to produce it on a scale that is required for the global population, it's not for one country or one continent. The whole globe wants it. And then to do it at a price that is affordable. And then to be able to actually distribute the vaccine and administer the vaccine. All that's not going to be easy at all. So it will not take anything less than 1.5 years or 2. Please remember, polio vaccine we've had about 40 or 50 years. And it took enormous national effort for years for us to be able to administer polio vaccine to all the children of India. And only recently, about a few years ago, we eradicated polio. So, but vaccine ultimately would be another way of the infection not becoming a dangerous thing to humanity. The third is some drugs may come up. Like in case of AIDS, we haven't developed a vaccine, but we now have drugs. And therefore, if somebody does get HIV infection, we are reasonably confident that the disease will be completely controlled. We can even use the expression cured. That may happen also, or at least even if the drugs may not act directly against the virus, it's possible that we will know the pathology much better, and therefore we will know how to deal with the COVID patients who are in critical condition and save lives. So until these things happen, we are not going to see the end of this whole coronavirus. It's a 2-year affair. We must keep that in mind. Therefore, any decisions we make about economy, about society, about polity must be based on that understanding. It's not a 1 month or 1 week affair. Okay, next slide, please. I have already said this. Herd immunity will rise and transmission will be halted eventually. Low-grade infection to the bulk of the people or vaccination, or the two ways of herd immunity. Indefinite lockdown will not yield benefits. Temporary lockdown, as we have done so far, that's the right thing. And severe COVID mostly in elderly and those with cardiovascular, lung, and diabetes diseases. So, therefore, when we handle this, the health part of the crisis, when we open up the economy slowly, we must make sure that these factors are kept in mind. Next slide, please. So what do we do? In the immediate context, as we ease the lockdown, slowly come back to economic activity, the South Korean approach of massive testing of both antigen and antibody. For those of you who may not be a little familiar with this, by now I think everybody knows about these things, but just in case. Antigen testing is what's called polymerase chain reaction. It is to actually detect the genome of the virus in the body. It is a definitive test, and there could be some false positives, false negatives in any kind of test, but in general, it is an assured test. You know that there is an infection, ongoing infection. It's necessary. And luckily, there are rapid antigen testing now available with reasonable degrees of efficacy, and it's getting better and better and cheaper and cheaper. We must do on a massive scale, both in government and private sector. One of the problems in some states like Telangana is private sector is banned, which is not very wise. We should allow the companies, the businesses, the institutions, offices to do on their own, at their own cost if they so wish, because then they can be assured what's happening. The second is antibody testing. Antibody testing is not very useful for an individual in terms of understanding whether there's disease or not. It's very important for the community. When the government or a business, they make decisions about continuing work or lifting lockdown, etc. The level of antibody protection that is there in the community because of the silent spread of the symptomless, asymptomatic infection, that's very, very important in making decisions. Right now, we're making decisions very blindly. We're shooting in the dark. Therefore, what South Korea successfully has done, some other countries, Taiwan has done, Germany is doing reasonably well. No, Germany has probably done about 5 to 6% or 7% of the population tested. America started very slowly and late, and now it's reached 2.5% of the population. United Arab Emirates has done 10% of the population, 10% of the population, including all immigrant population. They have 90% immigrants in that country, in those countries. India has done, I think by now about 1 million plus tests are done. That means one for 1,400 or 1,300 people. That comes to less than 0.1% of the population. You can see how far apart we are relative to the countries that are managing it well. So massive testing, rapid testing, both antigen and antibody is a necessary requirement to be able to make rational decisions without seriously hurting the economy. Social distancing norms must be mandatory. Your mask, your hand hygiene, distance, physical distancing maintained, avoiding large gatherings, washing with soap, and so on and so forth. These must be implemented. And those above 65 and those with pre-existing disease of a certain kind, they must be protected as far as possible. They must continue to be more or less, should not call it lockdown, but they must be largely in isolation at home. Subject to these conditions, normal economic activity must now continue with these precautions. Then efficient hospital care. We have very weak hospital care. As I said, we are lucky that we did not have the serious disease in the country, though the TV and newspapers, they're breathless with excitement. Every day, 100 cases, 1,000 cases, etc. But these are all peanuts. For a country of India's size, our disease burden, our transmission rates are incredibly small. But who knows what will happen in the coming months. Therefore, such as it is, we have one of the worst hospital infrastructures in the world among large economies. We cannot improve it overnight. But now that we had a couple of months breather time, and now that we have some capacity to get some things in place, personal protection equipment, the ICU beds, and where necessary, the ventilators, etc., and oxygen, even simple things like oxygen cylinders and so on and so forth. They must be effectively in place both in public sector and private sector in case we do get a big burden of disease with a lot of serious cases. Next slide, please. then the short-term focus for the economic rejuvenation, I'll just list them. They're self-evident. If you have any questions, we can take them in the question answer session, so we don't lose much time. Agricultural supply chains obviously are important. 45% or 48% of the Indian workers still depend on agriculture as the primary source of living. And B, in times of crisis, the first thing to be taken care of is that food reaches the table in every house across this length and breadth of the country. So it goes without saying, not only is it an economic issue, it's also an issue of life and death. Then construction industry, because that is the one that provides the largest employment for the unskilled workers. We have to restart, and government already all over the country, I think construction industry, they're now beginning to start this. Government has allowed it. But no, once there's a disruption, particularly once the immigrant workers, they've lost confidence in the big cities, it will take time for it to become fully normal. But well, because of the bungling that was seen initially, it's inevitable that there'll be some disruption even after the lockdown is relaxed. But I think already the government is on the right path. But this is not enough. We also must make sure that there's a special stimulus for some of these industries like construction, for instance, because there's not only a recession of demand and there's also recession of supply, both. Now, one leads to the other. This is a unique thing. This is not like 1929 economic crisis or 2008 economic crisis globally. This is a standalone, one-of-a-kind crisis in modern world in the past century plus, when both demand and supply are completely interrupted. Now, obviously, in countries like India, as migration continues to urban India in the medium and long term, there is a tremendous demand for both for space, both residential and business. But in the short term, because of the disruption, unless the demand is stimulated, unless you make it easy for people to buy space, the demand will not be adequate. And therefore, the whole system will be disrupted. Also, there'll be short-term serious cash problems for the construction industry. Therefore, this is the kind of an area where selectively government must come in, whether it's with the government money directly or with some special concessions through banks, or simply asking the banks to fund the loans to the companies based on the balance sheets, but interest-free, so that the government can pick up the interest bill, so that the government does not have to part with money. Right now, governments are also in fiscal crisis, both the union and the states. You take other countries, take United States. It's now coming up, already it's come up with about $2.4 trillion of relief package. That's more than 10% of the GDP, about 12% of the GDP. Another 8-9% GDP is on the annual in the next few weeks, next few days it will come. That comes to 20%. Germany already has reached 20%, $850 billion. Japan has reached 20%, $1 trillion. India has come up with about under 1% GDP. And of that, only half is actually new money. The rest of it is simply readjusting the budgetary numbers. So our stimulus is hopelessly inadequate. We have to increase the stimulus, but if that money is not, no matter how much we do, it's not sufficient. Our governments are broke. Therefore, we must find innovative mechanisms like, for instance, bank funds with interest subvention, so that the government's outflow is back-ended. It's not front-ended. You don't have to part with cash now because you don't have cash, but after a year or so, you can reimburse the interest as the government finances improve. Meanwhile, the business cycle will improve. And that's the kind of innovative mechanism that we must take up. Retail trade in all sectors, not only agriculture, then manufacturing, particularly small and medium enterprises, because already India, for a large economy, is incredibly weak in manufacturing. And if we kill manufacturing such as it is today in the country, it will be devastating for the country. Therefore, all efforts that I mentioned earlier must be made to strengthen manufacturing and come back to production as quickly as possible, and help to stimulate demand. I mentioned to you real estate, for instance. Then the financial services, without which the economic growth engine will be halted. Next, please. I think this is the last slide. Next, please. Okay, this is the last but one slide, I think. No, the one before that. Okay. Then medium term, I divide into three: short term, medium term, and long term. Medium term, we must build a viable healthcare system. India spends 1.1% of GDP on public health, one of the lowest in the world, and actually the lowest among significant economies anywhere in the world. Of that, union government spends only about 30% or so. The states spend about 70. Actually, union government spends 25% now, probably. The states spend about 70, 75%. If we can't, the rich countries with effective healthcare, they spend typically 8 to 10% of GDP. There is no way India can reach that level. Therefore, there's no point talking about absurd numbers in Indian context. Though they're rational numbers across the world, for India, they're absurd numbers. But we have already, FDR, Lok Satta have developed very robust models, actually. FDR, Lok Satta were instrumental in getting the National Health Mission in place. In those days, I was fighting for a robust healthcare system, but we got only a minuscule portion of that. Now is the time to push for a real healthcare system in the country. With just 1% GDP additional expenditure, but wisely spent, we can radically overhaul the healthcare system in delivery in India. And we can probably create about 15 to 20 million new jobs in healthcare sector, both public and private. It's a remarkable job creator, and it will dramatically transform the healthcare scenario of the country. Please remember, because of poor healthcare, about 25% of the people who are hospitalized in India are becoming poor during the year. They were not poor earlier. That number comes to about 6 crore people annually. Almost 1.5 to 2 crore people per day are becoming poor in India. It's an incredible number. Just imagine, if only we have a decent healthcare, even if the increase in no improvement in economic, poverty will end. It is that important for the country. Apart from human misery, loss of life and disease and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
The global retail chains in agriculture. Agriculture is in a deep crisis in India for a long time. We are arguing for only one thing. There's a lot to be done, but you must use the power of the context. Persuade the people to look at one or two critical changes in the context of COVID crisis. Now supply chains are disrupted. If only we have Walmart, Carrefour, Tesco, or even Reliance, doesn't matter, Indian or foreign is material. Basically, we are looking for end-to-end supply with elimination of the large intermediate in India, the middleman. The agent procures, does also the grading, the packaging, the transport, storage, processing, retailing, and most important of all, find the global markets. That is the idea. And that's the advantage of global chains. Whenever they come in, several things happen. Hundreds of billions of dollars of investment comes in. A very sector that is underserved, undercapitalized. Two, they improve value addition. Automatically, they go into processing, etc., and storage and eliminate wastage. Three, the farmer gets 70% of the end price because there's a compression of the market chain. Where there were typically 5 or 6 intermediaries, now there's no intermediary. There's only one agency that procures, does all this, and then sells. And D, they find export markets because they know how to deal with the global economy. India, for a large economy, is woefully inadequate in agriculture, in particular, in finding export markets because there's a phytosanitary measures, the quality control issues, the packaging, the grading, all kinds of things, understanding the demand, etc., etc. We just don't know. Only in 2 commodities. Rice, again, because of Lok Satta's effort, in 2011, the rice export ban was lifted. India is now the largest exporter of rice in the world. And 2, fisheries, where the world's largest exporter. Recently, we outstripped Thailand. That's because for a generation, the farmers struggled, sacrificed, took a risk. Ultimately, they found place in the global markets. But otherwise, we are pretty bad in global markets in agriculture. So for all these reasons, please remember, India has 12% of the world's agricultural land, fertile soils, plenty of rainfall, and year-round sunshine. No country has these advantages. We are simply not leveraging them. Agriculture could be a very important engine for not only growth and job creation, but also industrialization, the processing, etc. But it will not happen without supply chains. manufacturing hubs. Now, China, people are worried about China in the long term because not only China, any country. In a crisis like this, suddenly we discovered that all your supply chains could be disrupted. Now, China could quickly recover within 2 months. Supposing there's a long-term crisis and China is not able to manufacture all the intermediate goods required for the rest of the world, there would have been a devastation to the global economy, even more than what we are seeing today. Anything can happen anytime. So people are cognizant of that. And two, there is some amount of mistrust of China. And three, in any case, China is vacating space at the low end of the manufacturing because they are going up the value chain. And India is not taking advantage of that. Even a tiny country like Vietnam is taking advantage. Of course, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and of course, Korea and Taiwan always. And Mexico is doing a lot of it. And even some African. India is nowhere in the scene. Now is the time for us to aggressively go for 10 or 15 industrial hubs, eliminate all the unnecessary and foolish and corrupt restrictions like the silly labor laws which are preventing industrialization and employment, the silly land laws which are preventing land pooling for industry and business, and then build infrastructure and whatever incentives government can afford to provide at least in those small pockets, 10, 15 pockets of the country, and encourage manufacturing. We must aggressively go into that. Then in the medium term, yeah, I mentioned. Okay. Next slide, please. Last slide, I think. Okay. Now is the time to look at the robust architecture for city governance. The big crisis in COVID across the country was cities we were not able to manage well because of the large immigrant population, tremendous urban poverty, poor housing, no sanitation, overcrowding, and so on and so forth. You cannot probably change the constitutional architecture, which is very foolish for the local governments. I've spoken repeatedly about the 73rd, 74th Amendments. They created overstructured, underpowered, ineffective local governments. You cannot change all that. You may wish for that, it will not happen. It will be easier to make a case to change the architecture for the big cities, million-plus cities, because they are the hubs of economic growth. They are the future of India. Migration, urban migration, India is still at a very early phase. India has the lowest level of urban migration so far among large economies in the world. We're only at 30, 33%. It's nothing. It's going to be significant over the next few years and decades. And therefore, if you protect the big cities at least and create a new architecture of governance for the big cities, which is effective, which actually delivers and which localizes government with accountability, there'll be a dramatic change in the governance of India itself and politics of India. So this is the time perhaps to push for that. Then civil services, no, they're good with danda. They're good with crisis, election management, a COVID crisis, a disaster management, a VIP visit, and so on and so forth. They're bad with the actual delivery of services. Now, when you are so enthusiastic about a COVID crisis or something else, why can't you be enthusiastic to deliver things on a routine basis? Therefore, some kind of a service delivery norm. I don't want to go into details for want of time. We have discussed these things several times earlier. India still has a socialist mindset. Even now, if you notice, there are many people who said, no, the businesses and industries must pay salaries no matter what. Even as the government, which is simply collecting our taxes, is saying we don't have enough money to pay salaries. So this is absurd. What did the rest of the world do? Take United States. They spent $650 billion only to fund the salaries of small and medium enterprises in private sector. Imagine the government coming out with that kind of money for salaries in private sector. And they made it 90% subsidy, free to these companies, disbursed through banks. And where the companies still are not able to survive, they're taking care of the employees for a period of 4 months until they can be retrained and re-employed. India is zero at that level. Forget the government supporting. The whole approach is that because you started enterprise, you have employees, even if the business is shut down for no fault of yours, you are the sinner. This is an absurd notion. This is an opportunity to create a new discourse that a person who takes risks, invests money, starts an enterprise, employs a large number of people, and adds value and wealth is actually doing a noble thing. And they are the people who are sustaining the economy. They're paying taxes, they're producing goods and services, they're providing us foreign exchange, they're providing employment to the country. And without them, the whole system will come to a grinding halt. I think we have to use this opportunity to drive home the point socially and politically in the country. And finally, strengthen the rule of law. Our approach is even in this COVID crisis, while police worked very hard, the general approach is, if you come out of homes or something, even for buying some provisions, you are a sinner, you're a grave criminal, and then a policeman will beat you up or lock you up or seize your vehicle. No, the whole approach is one of danda. There's no serious rule of law. Now, if this continues, there'll be resistance. In time, the police will lose even the limited credibility they have, and managing big cities will become greater and greater challenge. Therefore, again, we can focus on, at least to a limited extent, on how to make rule of law work for our economy and for our society. I think the last slide, the concluding slide, next. See, Paul Romer is a 2018 Nobel Prize winner in economics. He said a crisis is a terrible opportunity to waste. 1991 reform came through crisis of a different kind, a fiscal crisis, and economic crisis, monetary crisis. Now, there's a crisis of a different kind, a global crisis, not of our making. But a country like India can do well to utilize that as an opportunity to look into the future, rather than worry about what's happening or what happened. That is the purpose why I prepared these slides, and that's why some of us are articulating the need for utilizing this as an opportunity to change the way India functions, because we missed the opportunity. In 1991, we brought about some reform, as you said earlier, but we haven't really engineered much of the reform. After the initial flush, we gave up. Now is the opportunity to really utilize this. We can't do everything, but at least some things which are highlighted by COVID crisis, I think we can utilize the opportunity. The young generation can now push this reform agenda and make the union and the states move in that direction. Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. And I have one question from myself. So because of the COVID crisis, actually created a bad PR phase for China. And many people, especially in India and most of the media and also young people, actually enthusiastic that we're going to actually get most of the companies from China. Most of the FDI going to actually divert to India. And I see it as very uncertain question, because India, it doesn't need not to be choose. I mean, like investor doesn't need to be choose India as their destination, because we have human resources and many other strengths, but at the same time, we have huge problems, especially with the way rule of law is actually working, the contract enforcement, and also labor laws and land reforms has not been touched for over a period of time. So how do you see, do you think we would be able to actually attract the investment at this point of time, where large number of governments actually, nations actually moving towards most nationalized ones? And do we able to attract more investment, FDI from China or else some other places? How do you say this one?
You're absolutely right. Somehow, there are many Indians who believe that we are ordained by God to become great. The rest of the world owes it to us, and they're begging us to come here, and we only have to give our nod. It's absolute rubbish. There are many countries doing very well, and China itself is doing very, very well. Please remember, it will continue to do well. No matter what we think of China, China will continue to do very, very well. But a part of Chinese enterprise will have to move out, not necessarily because China is bad, because China is going up the value chain, and also to have a greater insurance so that the over-dependence on one source for supply chain will not be there. And to some extent, some of the Western societies may want China to come down a peg. But we are not in the race right now. As I mentioned, like a tiny country which has even lower per capita income than India, like Vietnam, is doing far better than India in attracting investment. Even in low-end sectors, like let's say garment making, China exports $175 billion of garments annually. India is the world's largest cotton producer with enormous unemployed labor, and yet we are only able to do $17 billion. So the notion that somehow automatically things will happen because we are Bharat Mata, Bharat Khan, we are Punya Bhumi, it's all nonsensical. We have the potential to do pretty well. We cannot become another China, but even if 10% or 5% of Chinese mighty manufacturing machine comes to India in the short and medium term, that's a good start. And it will not happen in 6 months, it will happen in a few years' time. But provided the best case scenario for India is we can't change everything in India, given our politics and society. But what we can do is create some 10, 15 big hubs, each with about 50,000 to 100,000 acres of land, fully available land pooling done by the governments, union and the states, encourage competition between states, give all possible tax and other concessions in those areas, build infrastructure to global standards in those limited areas. You can't do for the whole country, but you can certainly do in 10 or 12 places. And if you can't do even, let us say, 1 million acres of land in India, that is only about 40,000 square kilometers of land. That's roughly equal to 2 or 3 district size in the whole country, or 3 or 4 district size in the country. If even there we can't build world-class infrastructure, we are worthless as a country. We should be able to build easily and quickly. And then for at least those areas, remove the current labor laws and the land laws. Have a more flexible and rational system. At least to that extent if we do it, then the world will get a signal that we are serious. But if we simply talk about investment, but we continue all this terrible bureaucratic, regressive, anti-wealth creating machine and the laws and the framework, nothing much will happen.
Well said. Thank you so much. And we will actually open the questions. And first question from Anas. Anas, could you actually speak yourself? Okay, then.
Unmute, whoever wants to speak, you may have to unmute or something, please.
Okay. Okay, let's move to second one. Harsha, you actually raised the hand. Could you speak your question, please?
Hello. Hello.
Hi, Harsha, go ahead. Okay. Okay. I will go ahead with the Anna's question, then we'll take the other one.
Yeah, you can.
So, what is the right health policy going ahead? Should private labs be given more autonomy in conducting tests? Is it? Yeah, that's the.
No, it's a no-brainer. You see, there are regulatory agencies in the country. Each of these tests and the kits, they're all certified by the regulatory agencies. Once they're approved, you must allow the government and private sector to do as many as possible. There must be very careful regulation, but not prohibition of private sector, because please remember, 70+% of the healthcare is in private. Actually, 85% of the healthcare is in private sector. 85%, 90% of the outpatients are in private sector. 60% of hospital beds and admissions are in private sector. And almost all tertiary care interventions, except a small select few, are in private sector. So there's no point pretending that you can do things without private sector. So you must allow both, but that's a short-term thing. But the long-term reform for healthcare, 2 big things. Those who are interested can look up at R&D website. You'll get plenty of literature. There's no time, therefore I don't want to go into details. But at a relatively low cost, a robust framework of family health care, of primary health care, so that each family can choose a physician of their choice, or can go to a physician of their choice within reasonable limits. In a system carefully designed. It operates well in Britain, what's called a GP system. A variant of it, which is actually more applicable to at least urban India. In Delhi, they have implemented the Mohalla, they're implementing the Mohalla clinics reasonably well. Something similar is what we have been articulating for quite some time, and it will not cost much. I will not go into details now. And tertiary care at the hospital level, today the government hospitals at the high end are hopelessly overcrowded because people go for all kinds of minor problems. because there is no primary healthcare system at all, which is credible. And they are very, very underfunded. And therefore, they don't have enough personnel, they don't have enough hygiene, and shortages of every kind. If you take a high-end hospital in India, in private sector, typically the annual billing and expenditure per bed is about, depending on the nature of the hospital, 50 lakh rupees to 1 crore rupees per bed. In government, typically in a teaching hospital, where a medical college, a nursing college, several other services are provided in addition to tertiary care services, 8 lakh rupees is the annual expenditure. How can you compare? You can at least make it 20 lakhs to start with. Later we'll. So in a very judicious manner, if you do it right, both these two things, at a relatively modest cost, you can dramatically improve the healthcare outcomes. Meanwhile, the insurance-based healthcare can continue for the secondary care services, not tertiary care services, but the secondary care. The Pradhana Mantri's Ayushman Bharat and Arogyasri in Telangana, Andhra Pradesh, etc. Models of this kind do work with public-private partnership for a certain spectrum. But they should not be used for the high-end spectrum, because then the cost will skyrocket without the commensurate benefit to society. There's a lot we can do in healthcare in the short term and in the medium and long term.
Okay. The next question from Madhav. Is it necessary to cut our expenditure on defense in order to provide more fiscal space for education and healthcare?
No, in general, all of us must want to cut down any expenditure that does not directly add to wealth creation. But having said that, we must understand a few things. Like I keep hearing this about defense from many people. I know where they're coming from, and I respect that. But we're not being very practical. India already spends one of the lowest ratios of GDP and defense among large countries. We only spend about 1.5% of the GDP. Most of the world spends 4, 5, 6, 7%. So we are not spending high. And two, most of this money is actually going towards salaries, particularly after the so-called one rank, one pension scheme and all that, salaries and pensions. So there's no room for reducing it. Don't be unrealistic. But if we continue to maintain this expenditure and reduce it as a share of GDP, instead of going overboard and having delusions of grandeur and overspending on defense, that's good enough. As the economy expands, and that's what actually governments are doing. NDA government, for instance, despite all the talk, they have maintained the defense expenditure more or less stagnant. And therefore, as a share of GDP, actually it has fallen, which is good. I encourage it. I welcome it. But beyond that, I don't think it's possible to reduce further defense expenditure and release some money from there.
Okay. The next question is from Sai Kiran. It's about public distribution system. So is universal public distribution system is possible in a true sense, as if Food Corporation of India is having such a huge surplus of the food grains? And also I would like to add one more add-on question to that one, because our public distribution system has been one of the inefficient ones. And we actually seeing that the money that actually trying to give to the poor people actually going some other hands, and also food is not actually reaching to the people who's actually they're trying to actually give. So how we can actually improve food public distribution system, and how much cash transfer actually can play a role in improving public distribution system?
Great question. First, why do we want public distribution system? Theoretically, there are two reasons. One is that food is not reaching people. Access. It's not true in India. It may be true in some countries or for some time, at some time. But in today's India, for a long time, not only today, for the past 30, 40 years, food reaches every part of India, from Andaman Nicobars to Himalayan heights, to the small islands, to coastal villages, to deserts. It's not that the food market is not working. It is the affordability that is a problem. And nutrition, probably. And when markets actually are working, the problem is affordability. Why have we built a massive system of procurement, storage, transport, retailing, and subsidization, which is leading to tremendous amount of corruption, leakage, inefficiency, and wastage. We are spending 1,50,000 crores annually in the so-called food subsidy. Most of it is wasted. There's enormous corruption in the public distribution system. The officials in charge of distribution system, their postings cost a few crores of rupees because there's a lot of corruption there. There's a lot of money to be made. Food Corporation of India has become a behemoth. Tremendous inefficiency and corruption. And apart from everything else, it's completely distorting the incentives in agriculture. We are overproducing food grains we do not need. As population is becoming more and more stabilized, as we're becoming slightly more prosperous than before and more health conscious, we are no longer eating massive quantities of rice as our ancestors were eating. We need now more fruits, vegetables, eggs, meat, fish, milk, etc., etc. And that is where we have a demand growing. There's a shortage of supply. Whereas we continue to overproduce rice and wheat because they are procured and the price keeps on going up unnecessarily. Whereas even among the major foods, forget fruits and vegetables and eggs and meat and milk, even major foods like oil, cooking oil, and pulses, which give in a vegetarian, largely vegetarian country, the proteins, India is the most deficient country in the world. We have the greatest surplus of food grains, carbohydrate, and the greatest deficit of both oil and protein. It's ridiculous. Take Telangana. They are spending tens of thousands of crores, in my judgment, unwisely for irrigation because it's not cost effective. I don't want to go into details, but whatever irrigation is coming is going for paddy. And we are taking pride in the fact that we are producing more paddy in a country we don't need paddy. Why are people going for paddy? Other crops, given the bad agricultural policies and bad supply chains, there's no guarantee, no price volatility is too high. While rice will not give you much profit, at least it's a safe crop. Somebody is procuring at a reasonable price. And then water is at zero cost practically. The government is giving you the free power or free water, whatever. Why not do it with flood irrigation? You're damaging the environment, damaging water table, and overproducing something. So the whole policies are distorted because of PDS. Therefore, the current PDS and procurement system, in my judgment, is a disaster for agriculture and for our economy. Therefore, the issue is not how to strengthen PDS. The issue is how to dismantle it and alter the incentives in agriculture so that the people produce what the market wants and they can realize the price. And how to get the supply chains in place so that what you produce gives you a good price. And the poor who require food, who are not able to buy food because of poverty, now we have Jan-Dhan accounts, we have Aadhaar cards, we can give Aadhaar linked direct money because they can buy whatever they want. That is the best way. So don't look at improving PDS. That is a retrogressive 1950s way. PDS is a relic of the past because of the interwar period between the First and Second World War, and during the war and immediate post-war period, there were famines all over the world and in India, Bengal famine, etc. We created extremely regressive laws, Essential Commodities Act. It's a draconian law, destroying agriculture and trade. And we came in massive controls and PDS. But that thing is over. For the past 40 years, that's not an issue at all in the world and in India. And that's why even the economic survey of the government of India in the last budget, they very strongly argued for repeal of the Essential Commodities Act and fundamentally changing agriculture. But even in the government, what one hand thinks, the other hand doesn't agree. Because the economic advisory part, they're going by evidence and logic, whereas the government's part going by politics and rhetoric. So PDS in the current form must be dismantled completely, protect the poor by cash transfer, but radically change the incentives in agriculture and improve supply chains. That's the way forward.
Okay. We'll take a question from the participants. Madhu Garu, can you go ahead? Could you unmute yourself? Can you unmute?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
Is my voice audible now?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. So recently, there was an announcement by the Uttar Pradesh state government abrogating certain labor laws, like a majority of them, which were completely regressive and which were completely incentivizing the industries from coming into the states. So I believe that this is an outcome definitely of the COVID-19, since many of the migrants who were in other states, they are returning back to the Uttar Pradesh state itself. So is this a step in the right direction? And if so, is this enough, or is there something that the government needs to do more?
Which state have you talked about?
Uttar Pradesh, sir.
Uttar Pradesh and Madhya Pradesh.
I vaguely heard about it. I'm not familiar with the details, so I cannot comment about the detail. But there's a lot more talk than substance. Some feeble efforts are being made here and there. Rajasthan earlier under Swatantrata Sindhya made some efforts. I think it has not been talked about much, actually. Rajasthan is one state which made earnest attempts to remove some of the regulatory hurdles for wealth creation. But in general, I would say the picture is disappointing. We're not doing enough. And if you can liberalize labor laws across the country, it's wonderful. In a country where there is massive unemployment, our whole emphasis should be how to encourage entrepreneurs to engage more and more workers. Whereas our labor laws always discourage an employer to engage more workers. It's almost a sin that you engage workers. And particularly after the COVID crisis and all the consequences, the temptation for entrepreneurs will be to go in for more mechanization and fewer workers. And therefore, it's a very well-known thing for the economists. Labor laws in the name of welfare of labor actually killed employment in a country with massive underemployment and unemployment. We require to create jobs. And only when the labor markets function, we're not saying there must be slave labor. You must have sufficient regulatory framework to prevent exploitation of that extreme form of labor. Otherwise, let the market decide the price, namely the wage, depending on the availability of workers and the availability of the work itself. So that must be the basic thing. But because I don't believe that's likely to happen across the country fast enough, and the past 10, 15 years is the evidence. And it's unlikely that in the next 1 year, dramatically we'll do some things. I don't believe that. I am urging that at least in 10, 15 hubs in India, you remove this existing framework and create a new and simple and straightforward framework comparable to the best in the world. That's more likely to pass muster.
Okay. So a couple of days back, Uttar Pradesh government actually dropped all the labor laws except 4, which is actually the basic minimum ones. So they given a holiday for reminding all labor laws for 2 years. So as I heard,
I would like to go through that, and if it's true, then I think they must be complimented. Except that, unfortunately, Uttar Pradesh may still not attract investment for other reasons. But the states that might attract investment must aggressively pursue that. Telangana and all the southern states and western states, that's where really wealth creation possibilities exist. And these states must aggressively pursue. There's no point Bihar and UP doing it. No matter what you do, in the short term, it's unlikely that big investment will go to UP and Bihar.
I hope southern states will actually follow those laws. Absolutely. And the next question from Raviteja Garu, could you be able to speak? Raviteja Garu. Okay, Ram Garu, if you want to go ahead.
Sir, this is Ravi.
Go ahead.
Sir, this is Ravi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Am I audible to you, sir?
Yes.
Please, yes, go ahead.
Sir, in this lockdown time, bureaucracy got more powers. So, do you think this will lead to license rush? Because in Maharashtra, police and other officers are deciding what are the essentials and what are not. Even they are seeing newspapers as essentials or not. Do you think this will lead to license rush?
That risk is very real in my judgment, because we're already a country with a socialist mindset. And already the general discourse in India is that anybody who creates wealth, established a factory or a business, is a sinner, is a bad fellow. That is the way the Indian public discourse in the media, in politics, and in society takes shape. That is our default option. And now, this kind of a control, even things which we as free citizens are able to do freely, that they control our lives and we meekly surrender, has become now the norm. during the COVID crisis. Therefore, the government's control of your life, your activities is normalized in our minds. And the governments and bureaucracy will definitely use it to their advantage unless we're all alert and we put a stop to that. Yes, the danger is very real. And the whole system will, why not after government must do it? If the government doesn't do it, who will do it? That will be the normal thinking. While the government must have enough power to protect the people and to promote the economy, the unnecessary power to mess up our lives, which already they have done considerably in the past 70 years, we must not allow them to have, and the young generation must be very alert every second.
Okay. So next question from Vivek, very interesting question. Kudos to Kerala crisis management. There is need to a lot to learn about us, but I'm wondering, because it's not a Scandinavia, but our neighboring state, what do we lack? Because why we are not
local government
okay,
Yes,
I will summarize this one. Why we are not able to do what Kerala is actually done. And he's also comparing it with it's not a Scandinavia and it's our state, our neighboring state. Why wouldn't able to do that? I just want to add something to the question. Scandinavia is not a socialist state because Scandinavian countries is ranked among the top 5 in economic freedom rankings, rule of law rankings. It's a very, very free market economy with a strong, big welfare state.
No, Kerala is actually a good example in some ways, though Kerala is not a good example of wealth creation. In other respects, strong local governments, a robust public discourse, and a decent healthcare infrastructure, not great, but a decent, half-decent healthcare infrastructure. By Indian standards, good, but by global standards, half-decent. Even that, you can see the significant difference. So what it means is that it doesn't take much to improve our conditions. We don't have to reach American levels or British levels of expenditure and technology in every sector. And that's what actually FDR looks at fighting for all the time. You don't have to spend 8% GDP to improve healthcare. Just spend 1 more percent, but wisely. That's enough. You don't have to do something dramatic. No, you can do a few commonsensical things. That's enough. Because that's what is achievable. Instead of asking for the moon, something achievable. Kerala healthcare management is a good example. How we can significantly improve the outcomes and management of a crisis, if only we put a few things in place. Among other things, those who may not be familiar, Kerala has only 900 panchayats in the whole state. Every district in Andhra Pradesh has probably 1,500, 2,000 panchayats. In Telangana, smaller districts now they are 1/3, 1/4 of the earlier districts. Each district has about 500 panchayats. It's absurd. Or 300 panchayats. The whole of Kerala has only 900 panchayats. That means the size of the panchayats, apart from empowerment, once you have the size, you have the economies of scale, you have resource base, but most important of all, you have the leadership capability. You cannot produce leaders from a 300 panchayat. It's a pipe dream. Once you have a 30,000 panchayat, there's a greater chance of some leadership emerging. So Kerala has, by a variety of means over the years, because of urbanization, because of aggregation of panchayats, because of local government empowerment, because of healthcare infrastructure, because of slightly better education, because of Narayan Guru's social movements before independence, before the missionaries' effort to promote education and healthcare, there are several factors that came together. Irrespective of which combine is in power, the broad discourse is more rational. They have their own follies, I have no doubt about it. But on the whole, they're more rational. They're more service-oriented. The government has to deliver the public services. And there's greater awareness and better quality of public discourse. And a combination of all these things certainly is having an impact. Time and again, we see that.
Okay. Thank you. And the next question from Amjad Patan. I will try to summarize the question. How do you see future of IT industry in India these days, and how can we able to utilize the power of IT to actually coming up from this crisis economically?
You said, how do you see the IT industry?
Yes, information technology.
I'm not an expert, so I cannot really answer this beyond some peripheral things. But my sense is that in the post-COVID world, there'll be even greater digitization, mechanization, robotics, etc. So far, our IT and IT-enabled services, while we are taking pride in what we are doing, we are still scratching the surface in the global economy. In a large market, our share is still minuscule. We are pretending to be a global superpower in IT. We are not. We are only there at the service provision end, about the back office IT-enabled services. We are not really there in innovation and new products and so on and so forth. And I don't know how well we are prepared for the modern economy, the economy of the future, for the 3D printing, the additive manufacturing, to robotics, to aggregators, to a whole lot of other things, which already are there in the anvil, but the COVID crisis has accelerated that process. In some ways, even from technology point of view, we may well see the pre-COVID and post-COVID world. This may act as a spur to accelerate the change in the world. If we can embrace those opportunities very quickly, we have the potential, but we don't have the skills. Our educational base, research base are very weak. But if we can, at least in a limited sense, very quickly ramp up those capacities, we can be a significant player. China has already occupied that space. China is already the leading country after United States in new patents, new research, R&D funding. R&D funding, actually, China is in excess of United States now. Quality of higher education, not too long ago, just 15 years ago, they thought their higher education was bad. But in 15 years, they've done everything, whatever it took, to build a very high quality higher education framework. We are nowhere there. We have to do a great deal more.
Okay. The next question is from Ram. Keep in mind that Indian population, because we're huge, and don't you think that Indian economy will fill up in coming months or years post-corona or post-lockdown?
No, Indian economy will
Come up. So how Indian population can actually affect economic growth?
See, we must avoid at all times two great fallacies in our logic. One is the 21st century world is not the 18th century world or 19th century world. Technology, economic progress, new models of business, innovative practices like aggregators, etc. They're changing life, even for us, even for you and for the very fact that we're all interacting in this form. We are no different from, let's say, Washington, D.C. or Beijing or Shanghai or Taipei in Taiwan or Seoul in South Korea. It's not because we as a country are doing great. It's because technology luckily has no barriers, and very cheap, very effective new technology has now come to help us across the world. So it happens anyway to everybody. Therefore, if we simply are content with that, then we're asking for too little. We're complacent. This is nothing compared to what's happening in the world. The second is that we are destined to be great and automatically things will happen. Again, another great myth. We are not destined to be great. We can be potentially great like any other society. If we do the right things in the right way, allocate the right resources, build the education, healthcare infrastructure and solid foundations, not merely physical infrastructure, but real foundations of education and healthcare quality, and build physical infrastructure and rule of law and other institutions and regulatory framework which is sensible. And we have many flaws in all these. And without correcting them, somehow assuming that we are the next great country, that's jingoism. That's not pragmatic approach. No, I yield to none in my admiration for our country, our past, our civilization, our culture. It does not mean that I'm blind to our follies. While we recognize our potential and our strengths, we must also recognize our weaknesses and our failings and try and overcome them with confidence, not with despair. So don't buy the argument that we'll automatically become a great country because Lord Krishna decided that we should be great. It doesn't happen like that.
Okay. Next question, Sujan, could you talk?
Yes, hello. Am I audible?
Yes.
Yes.
Hello.
Go
Hello.
ahead.
Yeah, sorry. Sir, I have two questions. Basically, like about the repealing of labor, taking out all the labor laws that are causing discomfort to, entrance of economy. Already, the laborers or whoever are in the, factories are already being exploited, and with the repealing of all these laws, like you have cited the reasons as corrupt protections that are, and we are putting the labor, like, without any protection, all these corrupt people, they uh, vulnerable to more exploitation.
Okay, your voice was breaking. I think I tried
Okay, your
to.
whole language is the language of 1950s, my friend.
That's it.
Corrupt
That's my question.
entrepreneurs, exploiting labor. See that the dehumanizing and the degrading exploitation that we have seen in the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century, the Dickensian novels were all about that. But the world of the 20th and 21st century are altogether different across the world and in India. It's no longer possible to have such degrading and dehumanizing exploitation, except in the unorganized sector to some extent if we don't take adequate precautions. Once we have taken care that the degrading and dehumanizing exploitation is not there, once the market works freely, remember, free markets work when there's real freedom. The laborer also must have freedom. If like Karnataka government, you say the immigrant laborers cannot go back home, you shall be here so that you are available for work, that's absolutely against fundamental rights and there's no labor. Those things must never be allowed to happen. Once that is there, then you must remember two things. An entrepreneur in a modern economy wants productivity, willing workers producing the best in a most efficient manner, not crude workers who produce something in a ham-handed manner, because you cannot sell your product. The quality and the productivity, they determine the profitability of a company, even the survival of a company. Therefore, entrepreneurs don't simply sack. It's a myth. Entrepreneurs actually want to retain competent labor. At the same time, if somebody is a troublemaker, not working at all, is becoming a negative influence, then there must be that threat, that fear, in government or outside. In India, we have eliminated that. But more important, there is compelling evidence across the world to show that the more unnecessary protection you offer to the workers already employed, the fewer new jobs we create. India is still at a 10% level of industrialization. We have to at least improve industrialization tenfold if you have to be anywhere near a modern economic powerhouse. We are hopelessly inadequate. And that means we have to employ more people, have more investment. If all that you do is protect the few already who are entrenched at the cost of the many who are coming into the labor market and deterring the new investors and new entrepreneurs, then India will perpetually be at this low level of equilibrium. Now, if that's what we want, so be it. If Indian society wants that, we are happy with what we have, let's not complain then. Then forget all notions of greatness. World over, when they allowed free movement of labor, free movement of capital, free movement of technology, had minimal but effective regulation, honest and corruption-free service delivery, there's a tremendous and good quality infrastructure and good education and healthcare, really good education and healthcare outcomes. They saw prosperity of societies. India is no exception in 21st century world. That's what we're arguing. So this notion that the current labor laws are protecting workers is absolute a sham. It's a nonsensical notion. It's a lie. All it's doing is it's driving towards jobless growth, or is driving towards growth of unorganized sector. Even companies like Maruti Suzuki and others, what are they doing? They're going for contract workers increasing because they don't want these wretched labor laws. Is that the kind of country you want? You want honest workers relationship, more and more workers in the organized sector producing more and more and protecting them in a sensible way, or you want this mythical protection at the cost of real employment and wage growth? So I completely reject your hypothesis.
Okay, thank you so much. And next question from Shashi. Shashi bro, could you speak?
Okay, we have to conclude in at the most 5 minutes.
Yeah, sure. The last question then.
Good evening, sir. So we are entering the phase of learn to live with COVID, right? Now we almost everyone knows that, okay, it's not possible to get it eradicated in time sooner. So what should be the steps government should take now to have a smooth transition that, okay, now we learn how to live with COVID?
No, I think what the government is across the country, governments are attempting is a reasonably good approach. There'll be, of course, in a country like India or anywhere in a large and complex country, there'll be some hiccups here and there. But slowly relaxing the lockdown, but preserving social distance norms to the extent possible is, I think, the right approach. There'll be some mix-up here and there. But one thing we must keep in mind is India is a very large country. It's a continental country, bigger than Europe. Therefore, there cannot be one shoe fits all policy. There has to be enough testing with sufficient granularity to have local database and local decision making based on data, not based on whims. Right now, most of the decisions, even if they're good decisions, they're whimsical decisions. They're not based on evidence. They're not data driven. So that's why testing and local decision making in a rational way, they're the way forward. Because supposing we relax this thing, it's possible that in some pockets there'll be a dramatic surge in the COVID infections. And if the infections don't lead to disease, it's okay. But it's possible in some pockets we'll actually have dramatic surge in disease itself, and hospitals cannot bear that. Then we have to be able to take steps locally. You have to put a stop to that. So unless local decision making is facilitated, not merely state specific, within the states also, local, but that means local data, local granularity. That means massive testing, transparent, both public sector, private sector being involved. Unless that is there and decisions are driven by data and local, we'll be making this needlessly painful and very halting. Otherwise, broad approach of the governments is reasonable at this point of time, given our conditions.
Okay. Thank you so much for your valuable time, sir. I hope we could actually put your thoughts into the policy action. I hope we can actually bring forward new wave of economic reforms that can actually help us to move forward towards building a strong Indian economy. And thank you so much for all of you who's actually joining today with Dr.JP Garu. And I'm really, really sorry for not able to provide opportunity to ask your questions. We will try to accommodate those questions alternative means. And next week we're having an interesting session, very radical idea, but also very, very relevant one, how we can actually improve urban governance through a free private cities initiative from Germany. So we would like to see all of you to how free private cities can actually help to improve urban governance. Which is actually a very radical idea even for Western societies, but we wanted to try to understand how they can actually improve urban governance and provide services to the people, not treating as just citizens, but as the customers. And thank you so much once again, JP Garu, for giving support and always being a guiding light in terms of intellectual. See you next week. Thank you so much.
Good luck, guys. Stay safe, stay smart, and think innovatively. Don't go by shibboleths, okay? All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, sir. Good night.
సార్ పేజ్ అండ్ తర్వాత మన ఏవైతే అకౌంట్స్ ఉన్నాయో మిగతా అన్ని అకౌంట్స్లో షేర్ చేస్తాం, ఎందుకంటే ప్రతి ఒక్కరికి రీచ్ అవుతుంది. యూట్యూబ్లో లేదు, మళ్ళీ సార్ ఫేస్బుక్లో ఉన్నారు. అంటే దాని అర్థం ఏంటంటే ఇప్పుడు ఈ టైం చూడకపోయినా నెక్స్ట్ అది అట్లానే ఉండిపోతుంది, దాన్ని మళ్ళీ తర్వాత చూస్తారు, అది సర్క్యులేట్ అవుతుంది. ఎగ్జాక్ట్లీ. దెన్ తర్వాత మళ్ళీ దాన్ని కట్ చేసి దాన్ని ఫేస్బుక్లో 70-80 దాకా ఉన్నారు, అప్ అండ్ డౌన్ అవుతుంది. 70 లైవ్ లో ఉన్నప్పుడు ఇప్పుడు కౌంట్ లోకి వస్తుంది. అప్పుడు తర్వాత నెక్స్ట్ 1-2 days లో ఎంత అనేది తెలిసిపోతుంది.